this week, everyone. You have on your handout a little bit of what we did last week and also what we'll do today. And I want to do just a little bit of review. I realize not everybody in the room might have been here last week, so just a little bit of review. Last week we talked not so much about the dominion view. I'm going to talk about that today a little bit, but we talked a lot about the domination view, which came into real force after the Enlightenment. And I had talked last week about a man named Lynn White, who in 1968 published a very famous essay on kind of the Christian roots of the environmental crisis. And he really laid a lot of the blame for the environmental crisis at the foot of Christianity. And the question that has been debated ever since was, how accurate is that? Is that true? And so I've been exploring that question a little bit last week, and we'll continue with that today. So just by way of a little bit of review, last week we talked about this dominant view, which is a kind of domination view of creation in Western Christianity, which really does not come from the Bible. And it comes largely from the infusion of Greek thought, Greek philosophy into Christianity in its very earliest years. Somebody asked me last week about, which Greek philosophers are we talking about? And so I did a little more research on that so I could think about that a little more carefully. And it really is mostly Plato, who brings this kind of great ladder of being thing. The human God is at the top, and then there are human beings, and then there are animals of various. There are God, angels, humans, and then animals of various kinds. And there's a whole pretty strict hierarchy in the great chain of being, and that does come to us from Greek thought. Largely Plato, a little bit of Aristotle, because he wrote a piece called Historia Animalium, in which he kind of does some ordering of animals, and Plotinus, and also Proclus. So the three main features of this view that comes into Christianity through Greek philosophy are that creation is instrumental, that is, creation is made not for God's own joy, but because human beings can use creation to make life better for themselves. Creation is hierarchical, so that great chain of being idea with God and then human beings. And then thirdly, that this is a subset of those pieces. Human beings are in a different category from the rest of creation. So those three sort of principles came into Christianity very early, in the earliest centuries. And just again, by way of review, here's our friend, not so friend, Francis. And he did many interesting and wonderful things, Francis Bacon, but he kind of crystallizes this view at the time in the 17th century, late 16th century, early 17th century, that nature can be enslaved for the purposes of humanity. And so that quote from him really kind of gets at what happened at the time of the Enlightenment, when that idea about nature and also, of course, about other peoples became a very forceful and powerful idea. So that's just a little review of what we did last week. Now I want to think a little bit about a different tradition in Christian history, because there's an important minority report. So that, this is the dominant view, but there was a very important minority report that was present from the beginning. And the person I want to lift up here is Basil of Caesarea. And he's often known as Saint Basil. He's a saint in the Eastern Church and also in Catholicism. He was a major figure in 4th century Trinitarian debates. So the 4th century was the great time of debating, like, what is the nature of the Trinity? What is the nature of the Godhead? And coming up with this idea that, God is the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Basil was a huge proponent of the role of the Holy Spirit in the Godhead. So he's most famous for that. He's most famous for being the theologian who really articulated a powerful theology of the Spirit. But he was also a wonderful sort of theologian of creation, if you will. He wrote a book called the Hexameron, which are his homilies on the first 6 days of creation. It's a whole book. It's like this big, and it's homilies on the first 6 days. And in those homilies, Basil is an astute and keen observer of the natural world. It's clear he loves the splendid world around him. He's just contemplating it with this deep sense of reverence and love. So here's a little quote from Basil. I want creation to penetrate you with so much admiration that everywhere, wherever you may be, the least plant may bring to you the clear remembrance of the Creator. Just this really beautiful attention to every detail. When he says every plant, I'm imagining the weeds, right? Because what are weeds but plants that are out of place, right? So Basil was just a huge, and continues to be an iconic figure amongst Christians who are very attending to creation care and environmental concerns. What's interesting about the Hexameron, that book of the 6 days of sermons, is that he stops before the creation of human beings. So human beings are created on the 6th day with other land animals. Basil, he just gets to he comes to the end of the creation of everything right before human beings, and he's like, I'm done. This is what I want to talk about, and I'm done. So there was this minority strain within Christianity continues. You can see it pretty clearly in some of the hermits, the ascetic figures from early Christianity, and who saw a much more integrated and harmonious relationship between humanity and nature. When we get to the Middle Ages, of course, the exemplar of this is St. Francis. Most people have some familiarity with St. Francis, and he's known for this, but he's also represents other voices in the tradition. The little icon of St. Francis, often seen with a bird or another a creature from the natural world. Just for fun, here's one with St. Francis and dogs, and also, cats. So he's widely, he pops up in lots of places where non-human creatures are present. In this context, it seems appropriate to give Pope Francis, the current Pope Francis I, a shout out because he has written now 2 encyclicals on the environment, one in 2015 and one in 2023 that just came out last September. And Pope Francis, is really drawing on this minority report within Christianity about the environment. He, of course, is named Francis because he took the name of Francis of Assisi from the Middle Ages as his name, his papal name, both because of Francis of Assisi's concern for the poor and also because of his concern for creation. So what Pope Francis and Francis of Assisi and Basil of Caesarea all have in common as they're thinking about these things is, if you will, a perspective of contemplation. So you can contrast the contemplation perspective with the instrumental way of thinking about creation that we saw in the domination narrative. So here's the philosopher Erazim Kohak, who talks about, he stresses explicitly that the ecological crisis is attributable to a failure of perception. We see poorly, not perceiving what is good. In order to think the good, we need first to see the good. So how might we perceive the good might be a good question. And this is where I think the Bible becomes a resource for us. And this is a pretty Presbyterian Reformed way of thinking about the Bible. It was John Calvin himself who suggested that the Bible is like a pair of glasses, which dispels the darkness and gives us a clear view of God. So it's about the way of seeing the world, and the Bible helps us to see the Bible more clearly. And here's Calvin with his own spectacles of scripture on there, someone's silly rendition on the internet. By the same logic, it's clear that asking the wrong questions prevents us from reading scripture in ways that lead to right perception. And here, just to say a bit about how Pope Francis's encyclicals on the environment have been received by some, and also he's written an important encyclical on immigration. A number, there he is with his encyclicals. These are wonderful, by the way, and quite readable, and you can find them on the internet. These are just beautifully written, thoughtful reflections on our relationship to create the rest of creation and how God is over all of that. So, but the way that this has been received by a number of folks, a number of people, including prominent politicians, have publicly said that the Pope has no business saying anything about these topics because they have nothing to do with the Christian faith. Yeah. So I mean, even I personally had a conversation with a very learned person, a former professor somewhere, who said that the Pope's weighing in on immigration and the environment is inappropriate because those issues have nothing to do with Catholic doctrine. So for many Christians, the Bible's, as you all know this well, seems to speak authoritatively about personal moral behavior, and encourages us to do charitable acts and tells us how to get to heaven. But it's all about whether we believe certain things or don't believe certain things. And this view is also held, this is what's interesting to me, by a lot of non-Christians who think that that's what the Bible is about, and people who don't really have much familiarity with a kind of non-stereotypical Christianity, right? So that view is shared by very diverse folks, right? And it's not, in my view, an informed one. As one of the things I think you all are aware of this, but trying to draw some attention to in last week and this week is how the Bible actually has a lot to say about how we are to relate to the rest of non-human creation and how God hopes that intends for us to be in relationship, and because we're in fact part of creation, we're embedded in the rest of the created world, and what are our responsibilities within that? So Kohak, going back to Kohak for a moment, his point is it's not just about pushing for particular policies, although that's really important, in order to help us push back on the environmental crisis that we're encountering, but it's about how do we perceive the world? How are we contemplating the world around us? Or are we not contemplating it and we're just using it for our purposes? Going back to Pope Francis, he highlights the connection between the environmental crisis and poverty. The fact that environmental degradation and climate change affect the poor disproportionately, and this is well known and well documented. Though wealthier countries, of course, are the primary producers of climate change. And Pope Francis channels the Bible and Basil of Caesarea and Francis of Assisi into a sacramental view of creation, which is Of course, this coming out of his Catholic tradition, this sacramental view. But I wanted to give a little bit of a flavor of what's in, this is from Laudate Si, the 2015 encyclical. And I'm going to read a little bit more than you see up here on the screen, just to give you a sense of how he is articulating our relationship to creation. Pope Francis says, the response of Francis of Assisi to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation or economic calculus. For to him, each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection. That is why he felt called to care for all that exists. Such a conviction cannot be written off as naive romanticism, for it affects the choices which determine our behavior. If we approach nature and the environment without this openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on our immediate needs. By contrast, and here's the quote up here, by contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. The poverty and austerity of St. Francis were no mere veneer of asceticism, but something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. So the Pope here understands that changing the way we perceive and so the way we feel about the world is crucial. He really emphasizes those bonds of affection. So think about how that's evoking our feelings about the natural world. Come back to that a little bit later. So to summarize this little foray into the history of Christianity's views of creation, we can see that the problem of seeing the world as full of resources to be exploited is not a biblical idea, but one whose roots can be traced to other sources. And so then we're going to explore a little bit, what does the Bible have to say then about our relationship to creation? And you have it on your handout, you can look at later. I give you a bibliography, excuse me. In case you want to read more, there are a lot of resources there which can be useful. But what I want to do now is just look at a couple of key texts in the Old Testament that help pull out some of what how we might think about the lens for thinking about creation. And the first text I want to look at is Genesis 1, and specifically verse 26. It's a famous one. Let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion, it's an important word there, over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild things of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Well, dominion, that's a really important word in here, and it's been there's been a lot of ink spilled trying to understand what that word means. So first, importantly, in the ancient Near Eastern context in which this text was written, a king or a queen is supposed to do justice and protect the weak against exploitation. So those are two key things, do justice and protect the weak. That was throughout the ancient Near East. Did they live up to that? Not really. But that was the articulated ideal, right? That sounds familiar, right, in human history. So here, the kind of dominion that human beings are to have over creation is envisioned like the relationship between a sovereign and the people. It's not a despotic vision of domination, but a protective one. So because human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, human beings are to rule as God rules. That's the idea here. The image, that image language is, so as God is to creation, so human beings are like stewards over creation. And that's the kind of rule that they are supposed to have, is that benevolent, protective one. Bill Brown, in his book, The Ethos of the Cosmos, which I think is on the bibliography, he puts it this way: the command to subdue and have dominion over the world is freighted with qualification. It is a mandate of stewardship, not exploitation. It is the blessing of gentle, life-giving dominion, consonant with the Creator's way. Ellen Davis, who's a wonderful Old Testament scholar, gives us a different translation based on the translation of one Hebrew preposition. Hebrew prepositions, by the way, can mean in English like 8 different things. So, when I taught Hebrew for 20 years to seminary students, and they would come to this one Hebrew preposition, and then in the textbook for the translation, it's in, with, by, among, through. There are about 8 different possibilities, so that every time you come to a translation, you're like, which one is it? So Ellen Davis is working with that a little bit here when she looks at this verse. She says, "Let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness, that they may exercise skilled mastery among the fish of the sea and among the birds of the air," because of that preposition, which has so much. It's so capacious. It has so much possibility in it. All right. So we can go on, because Ellen Davis makes another interesting point. And that is around what happens in verses 29 and 30. So this is just the NRSV, it's not a translation issue, but "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food." And this is talking to the human beings, "and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." So what she's doing, and what Ellen Davis does in her book, is she links this verse to the preceding command to human beings to have dominion. And she's arguing that the most essential activity befitting human beings created in the image of God is to secure the food system that God gives to sustain all creatures. So just go back for a second. Because of that, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And the human role of being in the image of God is to help oversee that food system, which might have implications for how we think about habitat destruction and other issues. All right. She thinks, by the way, just a final point on her argument there, in chapter 3, of course, we have the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve and the fruit of the tree. And Ellen Davis says, it's no accident that the first violation in chapter 3, when the human couple take the fruit, is an eating violation. So there's a connection there. All right. I want to turn now briefly to Genesis 2. We were just in Genesis 1, but the second creation story. And I want to zero in on the creation of the human being there, beginning in verse 5. And we talked a little bit about this last week, but I want to go a little more in depth here. When there was no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, the Lord had not caused it to rain. There was no one, no Adam, right, no human being, to serve the ground. And then in verse 7, the Lord God formed the Adam and breathed into its nostrils the breath of life, and the Adam became a living being. And we talked about living being last week. So here, that serve, that verb that often in English translations gets translated as till, to till the earth, it actually means to serve. So if we actually translated it that way, we would get a different feel about the purpose of human beings, which is to serve the earth, right? Tend the earth. The purpose of human beings is to serve the ground, not the ground to serve the human beings. And Genesis 2 shows us God making a garden and making this human being to care for the garden. Before we leave Genesis 2, I do, this is my translation from the To Serve It and Preserve It, and we had discussed that pretty much last week, but that's just a reminder of it. Before we leave these verses, though, I do want to say something about Calvin, because John Calvin, is a help here. He often gets a bad rap in modern contemporary. He's sort of turned into a stereotype, or he's become a meme. But Calvin actually has some wonderful things to say about these verses. As you see here, being content with the frugal and moderate use of them, the things that God has given us, we should take care of what remains. Let him who possesses a field so partake of its yearly fruits, that he might not suffer the ground to be injured by his negligence. But I love this part. Let him endeavor to hand it down to posterity as he received it, or even better, cultivated. And let us, each of us, regard ourselves as the stewards of God in all things, that we will neither conduct ourselves dissolutely nor corrupt by abuse those things which God requires to be preserved. So Calvin really has there's a lot of good stuff in Calvin. What happened to him, I think, was, so here he is in the 16th century writing some really powerful theology, and along come his followers in the 17th century, and they kind of turn it into a system and kind of suck some of the life out of it. And that's, I think, when people have a negative view of Calvin, it's often of what happened in the 17th century through this sort of scholastic movement. Anyway, that's another talk. So I do want to, just a reminder, what Calvin is doing here is going back to Kohak's idea. We have to perceive the good, right? We can't just think it or do it. We have to perceive it. Now, I do want to take a brief look at Psalm 65, which is on your handout. And I wonder if I could ask someone just to read the psalm, the verses here from the psalm, verses 9 through 13. Can I get a volunteer with a good loud voice? Oh, I know somebody can do it. Come on now. Can you verses, not just read the part of the psalm that's on the page?
You, O God, this is the earth and all that is. You greatly and richly, the river of God is full of water. You provide their grain, thus you provide for the earth. You water it flows abundantly, certainly it breathes, softening it with showers. It grows, you bless. You crown it here with goodness and beauty. Your path overflow with richness. The path of the wilderness overflow. The hills get themselves with wealth. The meadows are clothed in floods. The valleys get themselves with rain. They shout and sing together for joy.
Thank you so much. Thank you for doing that. That was wonderful. So just a few things I want to pull out of this psalm. You notice that the imagery in verse 9 is of the rain God provides that makes it possible for grain to grow. And then verse 10 pauses on the image of the water making its way across the earth, right? You, O God, water its furrows abundantly, settling its ridges, softening it with showers. And then the summary statement at the end of verse 10, the earth's growth you bless. What's interesting about this is we live in a consuming society, right? That focuses on the products, not the process of growing things. And Psalm 65 is a meditation on the process of growing things, with God as the farmer who tends to the creation as a farmer cares for the earth she has sown. So in verses 12 and 13, we see the earth offering its praise to God. I love this imagery in here. clothing itself in joy simply at being part of God's growing abundance. And here we see it in the hills and the meadows and the valleys, who wear their bounty like a splendid outfit. And the psalm opens back in verse 1, you don't have this, by saying, verse 1 of Psalm 65 is, to you, O God, silence is praise. And you think about how often, we humans are just a loud species. And when you think about other species, and often there's silence, and not just species, but the plants and everything that grows. So Ellen Davis notes in her commentary on this psalm, human beings would do well to be quiet more often. And she says of this psalm, God's praise does not come from human lips, but rather from the fruitful earth itself. The psalmist is challenging us to hear what we cannot hear, deafened as we are by our own constant noise. Calling for an end to all that noise, this verbal icon, she calls the psalm a verbal icon, reveals to us the great harmonious hymn of all the creatures, the silent praise they give to God. So, in Psalm 65, God is this farmer who perceives the whole beautiful world as a place of growth for everything that grows in it, including us, human beings. If we use Scripture as a lens for seeing this world, we will begin to perceive it as beautiful, just as God does, kind of along the lines of this Kohak quote. All right, I want to switch gears, and now I promised last week to talk a little bit about the Reformed tradition and Presbyterians in the history of the modern history of the environmental movement. So I want to end by talking a little bit about that. So the Reformed tradition has had really an outsized influence on the environmental movement in the last 2 centuries. And here I'm drawing from the work of Mark Stoll in a book called Inherit the Holy Mountain, and it's on your bibliography in case you're interested. Stoll looked at the religious upbringings of the major figures in the environmental movement of the 19th and 20th centuries. And what he found, and he was surprised by this, was that a highly disproportionate number of those important figures grew up in the Reformed tradition. That is, they grew up either Congregationalist or Presbyterian, because Congregationalists and Presbyterians have basically the same theology that comes from Calvin and that channel. So in the early to mid part of the 19th century, it was largely the Congregationalists. And this is what Stoll says. Virtually every single person associated with the early movements for parks and forest conservation in the 19th century was no further than 1 generation away from a Congregational church in a small New England town. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of this. The first one is Frederick Olmsted. He was raised Congregationalist, and he was deeply, as you may be aware, committed to the conservation of public green space. He was most famous for designing Central Park in New York City, but he designed many other parks and school campuses, really in lots of different parts of the world. He didn't do that much work in Virginia, but he did make a plan for the Richmond neighborhood where I actually live over in Sherwood Park. There's Brooklyn Parkway is this curving kind of very pretty road that was the first part of what was supposed to be a larger Olmsted designed neighborhood. So there's a little trace there of Olmsted. But he was, and probably still is, the nation's greatest and most influential landscape architect. By the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, Congregationalists had sort of disappeared from the environmental advocacy scene, only to be replaced almost entirely by Presbyterians. So a prominent example from this period is John Muir, who campaigned to preserve what is now Yosemite National Park and was the founder of the Sierra Club. There's been some recent conversation about his legacy. That's another conversation. Beginning with Muir, Presbyterians became a dominant force in federal positions promoting conservation. So the progressive era between 1885 and 1921 was the best period for environmentalism in U.S. history. The National Park Service, the U.S. Forestry Service were created at this time. Instrumental in the creation of the U.S. Forestry Service is this man, Gifford Pinchot, who had a maternal lineage of Puritans and Huguenots, that is, the predecessors of Congregationalists and Presbyterians. He was, as I said, largely responsible for the founding of the U.S. Forestry Service in 1905 with the help of Teddy Roosevelt, who also had Presbyterian roots. Pinchot, by the way, very interesting guy, was a little eccentric. His fiancée died tragically when they were both quite young, and he remained unmarried for another 25 years while he communicated with her spirit regularly. And finally, after 25 years, he said that she told him that he could get married. So he did. Yeah. There's a wonderful book. I might have put it on here, on the bibliography, is a book called The Great Burn. Did I put that on there? Yeah. Oh, The Big Burn. Excuse me, The Big Burn. Has anybody read that book? Oh, that is a great book. Anyway, it tells a little bit of the story of Gifford Pinchot in there, and it's a really fast and fascinating read. Anyway, okay. So those years, 1885 to 1921, were some people call it the progressive Presbyterian era. Presbyterians held the White House for 28 out of those 36 years, and the Department of the Interior was headed by Presbyterians for 43 out of 57 years between 1889 and 1946. Progressive conservationists were nearly all raised Presbyterian. The dominance of Presbyterians in the environmental movement more generally lasted through the mid-20th century, well into the 1960s. And here's Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson, who wrote probably the most influential book on the environment when she published Silent Spring in 1962. That was a book that just galvanized the environmental movement in the 60s, led to the regulation of DDT and other chemicals. She also was raised Presbyterian. By Mark Stoll's account, Rachel's mother, the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, would conduct nature studies with Rachel in their backyard. The mother, this is Stoll saying, dour, stern, devout, and always dressed in black. And then finally, Lynn White, who I started with last week. Lynn White, whose 1966 address and subsequent article in Science magazine drew critical attention to the role of Christianity in environmental degradation. And as I told you last week, he was a cradle-to-grave Presbyterian. So almost all the key figures in the environmental movement were shaped by the Reformed theological tradition. And so that raised the question for me, what is it about the Reformed tradition that somehow fed these people, right, in a way to perceive the world around them differently than the dominant way of doing so? So here, I think, are a few core values of Reformed theology that might lead one to engage with environmental issues in the public realm. So I just want to offer a few of those. One is the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God counters the anthropocentrism to which is, of course, our dominant impulse. Secondly, the pervasiveness of sin, the understanding that sin is very pervasive, right? That's a Reformed belief. It counters greed and fosters public policy to curb it because it knows how pervasive sin is, right? So, covenant life, the common good, counters American individualism. Careful stewardship counters rapacious ostentation. And we saw that back in Calvin, right? That that push for careful stewardship, which is rooted deep in the Reformed tradition. And then God's call to service and to work for the transformation of society counters passivity and resigned acceptance of the status quo. So these things are pillars of the Reformed tradition, and so of Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and I think fed these people as they were thinking about the natural world. But one fact I've held back so far in talking about them is that the vast majority of these environmentalists raised on Reformed theology, they left the church at some point in their adult life. Stoll, in his book, puzzles over this fact. And what he wonders, and I wondered, what's the connection between being a lapsed Presbyterian and an environmentalist? And this is my theory. I want to suggest that growing up on Reformed theology implicitly gives one a way of seeing the world that encourages care for creation and the motivation to act in the public sphere for its protection. I think that's all implicit there. It stirs one to see God in the beauty of creation and the belief that because of the pervasiveness of sin, only public policy will protect that beauty. But as these young people grew into adulthood, perhaps they also saw that the church was not really living by its convictions, that the actions and inactions of the church were in conflict with the core values that were being articulated. So these environmentalists took those core values they'd learned and they went into the world, they went into government, determined to fight on behalf of God's beautiful world. But they left the church behind because its actions were not congruent with its inherent values. I want to just conclude by returning to the question of how we perceive the world. The environmental scientist and activist August Spate, he says he used to think that environmental problems could be solved by science, but then he realized that that wasn't the case. And you see this in this quote. He says this is really... we need a cultural and spiritual transformation, and that's not something scientists, it's not really in their job jar to work on that. That's our work, to work on cultural and spiritual transformation. Because what is needed is a different way of seeing the world. So I've suggested that reading the Bible with new lenses is one way of seeing God's world anew. And here, just a final image here from Thomas Cole. Stoll begins his book with painters reared on Reformed theology. There was a whole movement in landscape painting in the early 19th century, and most of these painters were, yes, Congregationalists. And you see how early American landscape paintings endow the landscape with a moral quality. A nature embodies God's glory for these painters. And why begin with painters? It's not surprising because we've been talking all along about seeing the world, right? The way that we see the world. And so artists, painters, creatives, these are also the folks who can help us to see the world differently. I'm going to stop there, and we have, I think, a few minutes for 10 minutes. Drake is the authority here, and we have 10 minutes for questions or comments, thoughts. Yes. Good morning. This one? Mm-hmm.
Provided everything that we causing us to appear favor. Give it favor. So it's something as complete as the house being in construction or in the family. If we try to rectify or fix the fault, if we don't know how, we have to go to the manual. We have to go to the architect. When you get out of this way, you look up God.
Hmm.
God will ask you, yeah, you brought us here. We are complete. This is
Very, very well said. Yes, very nice. Yeah, I think the space here is particularly speaking to there's a whole world of folks today who think that science will get us out of our problems. And I'm not diminishing, by the way, the role of science and technology and I think that goes along very well with the Reformed tradition of like, we need all truth is God's truth, and we like the life of the mind which pursues truth to the ends. That is who we are. I think what he's saying is for those who think this is simply a matter of, finding the right technical solutions, he's saying that that's not going to help us if we don't have just a completely different way of seeing ourselves in the world. So, yeah, excellent point. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, great question. So I think the Bible, of course, is many different voices, but I think if we think about kind of one of the drum beats of the Bible is that the good, and if you will, the good life, is something that God intends for us in this life and also in the life to come. We see that very nicely in the Gospel of John, where the definition of eternal life, I actually don't like that translation, but it's actually life for the ages. The definition of life for the ages in the Gospel of John is a relationship with Jesus. So, or like with God through Jesus. That's very John. But the point is, it's not time bound. It's not about just in heaven. It's about now, and it's about in heaven, and God intends for all of us and all of creation to flourish now and also after we pass. So, yeah, great question. Other thoughts, questions, things that come to mind? Yeah. Oh. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's a great. Drake, do I still need to be tied to the mic? Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay. No, it's fine. My propensity is to start moving around, but I will stick to the mic. So that's a great question. The Reformed tradition is one branch of Protestantism which arose in the early 16th century. So there's the Reformed tradition, which is associated with Calvin, John Calvin. There's the Lutheran tradition, associated, of course, with Luther. There is the Anabaptist tradition. These are sometimes called the peace traditions, which, are characterized largely by pacifism and a kind of separation from society. So the questions about, some of these questions that are up here, like about working for the transformation of society, it's not that it's not Lutheran, but it's just distinctively Reformed, and it is not at all the Anabaptist way. The Anabaptist way is like, to be authentic Christians, we need to kind of remove ourselves from the sin of the world, right? Reformed Christians are like, no, we need to get in there and try to transform society because that's what God would have us do. Be working for policy changes and in government and so forth to make this world better accord with the will of God. So the Reformed tradition is just one branch of that Protestant Reformation, but it is in some distinction from the Lutherans, from the Anabaptists, and from Roman Catholicism, out of which all of them were reacting. Does that help a little bit? Yeah, so this ends up being kind of, Presbyterians, sometimes they're the butt of jokes about this because the original Calvinist language was the total depravity, right? Human beings are totally depraved, which, it doesn't have a nice modern ring to it. But the point of that is to say that without God's help, we really are subject to our own egotism and selfishness. And we are going to do what feels good for us, not what is right for the community as a whole. And the flip side, so just putting a lot of emphasis on sin. And the flip side of that is that in the Reformed tradition, God's grace is abundant and overflowing, right? And that by the grace of God is how we are able to be in a process of sanctification, of being, there are the two pillars, there's justification and sanctification. Justified means that when Jesus died on the cross once and for all, that's it. We are saved, and we can talk about what saved means, but we are saved. And then sanctification is our life as we live it over time, trying to live into that reality. And what does that mean to fulfill God's will? And God's grace helps us with that sanctification. So that is different from some other, like from the Methodists, for example, who have a somewhat different theology. So the emphasis on the total depravity of human beings is a big Reformed emphasis. And I don't like to use total depravity because people are like, what? but instead talk about the pervasiveness of sin. And my joke about that is, there's plenty of empirical evidence for the pervasiveness of sin. That's like our biggest selling point, I think, in our sort of our religious worldview. There's plenty of that, both personal and systemic, right? So, great question. Yeah. Oh, Drake's given me the high sign. So, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be with you, and look forward to seeing you in worship. Oh, okay, yes, just pop it up here. Thank you. You're welcome, Greg.